Oh, you should do a video about how the tech itself reshaped us. Think about it. We went from vinyl to cassettes to CDs to digital, from VHS to Laserdisc to streaming. And we transitioned from landlines to bricks to smartphones and nothing. That was a comment left by Jeff on our last video. And when you read that list, you don't just see a history of gadgets, you see a history of neurological reconstruction. If you were born between 1976 and 1985, you didn't just get better tools, you had to reinstall your reality every few years. And that quiet, heavy fog you're feeling today, it isn't stress, it's a system error. Your 1994 hardware is trying to run a 2026 world, and it's kinda hitting a limit. Think about the nothing that Jeff mentioned at the end of that list. If you grew up in that window, you remember a world of high friction. If you wanted to see a friend, you navigated a physical neighborhood. If you wanted to know a fact, you navigated a physical library. This friction wasn't an obstacle, it was a cognitive buffer. Every task had a beginning, a middle, and a physical end. When you finished a research paper in 1995, the task was complete. You put the pen down. You felt the weight of the paper. Your brain received a clear somatic signal. Task complete. Power down. But today, we live in a state of semantic flattening. Your brain can no longer distinguish between a minor ping and a life event. Digital tasks never truly end. An email thread can be resurrected at midnight. A social media feed never hits the end screen. You're living in a state of open-loop chronicity. Your brain is holding on to 1,000 unfinished threads because the digital world has removed the physical snap that signals closure. You're exhausted because you're technically still working on every task you've started since 2012. Organizational psychologist Sophie Leroy calls this attentional residue. When a task stays unfinished, part of your mind stays permanently attached to it. The late neuroscientist Bruce McEwen pioneered the term allostatic load. It's the wear and tear that accumulates when your body is exposed to chronic, low-grade pressure. For the Xennial, that pressure comes from incessant updating. Think about that list again. Vinyl, cassette, CD, MP3, stream, landlines, pagers, SMS, smartphones. You didn't just upgrade your tech, you had to refactor your expectations of how the world works, over and over. And now, just as you thought you finally mastered the digital landscape, the world is demanding the biggest update yet: artificial intelligence. You're being asked to relearn the concept of truth. You're being told that the deep, slow skills you spent 40 years honing, writing, researching, creating, can now be generated in 4 seconds. This constant demand to relearn what it means to be a productive human has created a specific kind of structural fatigue. Your brain is a library that has been burned down and rebuilt every decade. That fog in your mind isn't age. It's structural obsolescence. Your internal processor is overheating from the volume of legacy code it's trying to run while managing a high-speed AI-driven feed. Most generations get one version of the world. You've had to survive 5. This requires an enormous adaptive tax. Every 5 years, the world asked you to delete who you were and learn someone new. This leads to a permanent state of mental gear shifting. You have a Gen X brain, one that says handle it yourself, fix the problem. You were raised with what psychologist Julian Rotter called a high internal locus of control. But you have a millennial heart, one that was shaped by the early, optimistic internet. You crave connection. You want emotional depth. This creates the bridge paradox. You're independent enough to do it all alone, but emotionally literate enough to know how heavy alone feels. Because you speak analog and you speak digital, you've become the universal translator. You're spanning a canyon that is widening every day. You aren't just an adult. You're the designated custodian of reality for everyone else at the table. But here's where it gets complicated. The overload isn't just coming from the outside, it's coming from your own neurological loyalty. Deep down, you still trust the physical more than the digital. That's why you still feel a secret hit of dopamine when you see a corded phone in an old movie, or the grain of a film stock photo. Your brain is searching for a tactile anchor. Digital life is ethereal. It has no weight, no smell, and no physical location. For a brain wired in the late 70s or early 80s, ethereal feels like unsafe. Because you don't feel the information in your hands, your brain stays on to make sure it hasn't vanished. You're doom scrolling, not because you're addicted to the news, but because your brain is trying to find the bottom of the page, so it can finally feel safe enough to sleep. But the page has no bottom. The content never ends. We've spent a lot of time talking about the weight, but let's look at the advantage. Because you grew up with boredom as a lab, you have a neurological reserve that younger generations are currently paying thousands of dollars in retreats to try and simulate. You have analog depth. When a meeting feels shallow or a social interaction feels like a performance, you feel annoyed. That annoyance is actually your internal calibration telling you that the world has lost its weight. You're one of the last people who remember what it feels like to be human without a signal. You know what the water looks like because you remember being dry. This isn't just a Xennial problem. It's a human problem that you are simply the first to diagnose. Sociologist Dana Boyd describes this as context collapse, the flattening of your multiple social selves into one digital space. We've traded the right to be away for the convenience of connection. You remember the answering machine? That wasn't just tech, it was a boundary. When you left your house, you were sovereign. The world had no claim on your attention until you decided to give it back. Today, that sovereignty has been replaced by context collapse. You're a parent, a worker, a citizen, and a consumer, all in the same 10-second scroll. Your brain is never allowed to inhabit one self at a time. The system error you're feeling is your brain trying to protect your internal privacy. It's shutting down because it's tired of being public 24 hours a day. There is a term for this specific type of grief, coined by philosopher and researcher Glenn Albrecht: Solastalgia. It's the distress caused by environmental change while you are still living in that environment. You haven't moved houses, but the world you grew up in, the world of privacy, linear time, and physical presence, has been paved over by a digital strip mall. You're homesick for a world that still exists geographically, but has vanished psychologically. This creates a state of nostalgic displacement that leads to permanent brain fog. You're living in a world that looks like home, but doesn't feel like home. You don't need a digital detox. You need a tactile recalibration. Build friction back into your life. Do things that end. You weren't born too late or too early. You were born at the seam, between a world that could switch off and one that never does. You're the last generation that remembers what enough feels like. And that fog you've been carrying, that weight you can't explain, it's not weakness. It's the cost of never getting to shut down. So no, you're not broken. You've just been running in a world that forgot how to stop. Take a breath. You've done enough updating for today. And as always, you matter.